The night my half-brother pressed his forearm against my throat and told me I was nothing but a burden on this family. I didn't fight back, I just looked at him, and I thought he actually believes that. I was 31 years old. I had a nursing license, a car I'd paid off myself, and a weekend bag sitting by the front door because I'd driven 4 hours from Ottawa to Sudbury to check on my mother, who'd been complaining about chest tightness for 2 weeks. My stepfather thought she was exaggerating. My half-brother thought I was exaggerating when I said she needed a doctor. Nobody in that house thought anything was wrong except me. And apparently showing up uninvited to make sure my mother was okay was, in my half-brother's words, starting problems. That was Saturday night. By Sunday morning, I understood that I had completely misjudged how far things had gone. My mother had remarried when I was 11. My stepfather, Derek, was the kind of man who filled a room with his voice before he filled it with his presence. He had opinions about everything: the government, the weather, the way I held my fork, and he delivered them like verdicts. My mother laughed at his jokes and deferred to his moos, and slowly over the years became someone I barely recognized. She stopped calling me just to talk. She stopped asking about my work. She started relaying his opinions as though they were her own. His son, Kyle, was 2 years older than me and had lived with them full-time since he was 16. We were never close. He made it clear early on that my presence in his father's house was, at best, tolerated. I learned to be small around him, quiet. I learned to time my visits for when he was working or out with his friends, and I learned to leave before he came home. But that weekend, the timing was off. I'd arrived Friday evening to find my mother looking grey. Not sick grey, but tired grey. The kind of tired that settles into a person's face when they've been managing something alone for too long. She hugged me at the door and held on a beat longer than usual, which should have told me something. Derek barely looked up from the television. Kyle wasn't home yet. My mother made tea and we sat at the kitchen table, and she'd been short of breath for a few weeks, that the tightness came and went, mostly at night. I asked if she'd called her family doctor. She said Derek thought it was anxiety. I asked if she'd called the doctor herself. She looked at the doorway to the living room and said she didn't want to make a fuss. I made an appointment for her the next morning using the provincial health line. I didn't ask permission. Derek noticed. By Saturday afternoon, he'd made 3 comments about how I swooped in and disrupted the household, and how my mother was fine, she'd been fine, and there was nothing wrong that a decent night's sleep wouldn't fix. I smiled and nodded and made dinner because my mother looked like she hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Kyle came home around 9. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me the way he always had, like I was furniture that had been rearranged without his consent. "Didn't know you were coming," he said. "Just for the weekend," I said. "Mom wasn't feeling well." "She's fine. She has an appointment tomorrow morning." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like the particular resentment of someone who has decided that another person's competence is a personal insult. "She doesn't need you flying in to play nurse," he said. "She has a family." "I am her family." That's when he stepped into the kitchen. "I want to explain something, because I've read the kind of comments people leave on stories like mine. Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you stand up for yourself? You work in healthcare, you're trained for emergencies. Why did you just stand there?" Here is the honest answer. There is a particular paralysis that comes from being in the home where you learn to be small. Muscle memory is a real thing. 20 years of making myself unobtrusive in that house, of choosing peace over confrontation because the cost of confrontation was paid by my mother. That doesn't dissolve because you're an adult with a career and a life outside those walls. You walk through that front door and some part of you becomes 11 years old again. Kyle pressed his arm against my throat. Not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to make clear that he could, and told me that I thought I was better than them, that I always had, that my fancy education and my Ottawa apartment and my government job were just ways of looking down on people like him and his father. I didn't fight back. I said very quietly. Let go of me. He did. He stepped back and laughed, and it was worse than the aggression somehow. That laugh, like the whole thing had been a demonstration rather than an argument. He turned and walked to the fridge and got himself a beer, and I stood there in my mother's kitchen and understood that he had done this before with other people and that it had always worked. My mother hadn't come downstairs. I took my bag from the front hall and I drove to a motel off the highway, and I sat in the parking lot for about 40 minutes before I went inside. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about my mother's face when she talked to me at the kitchen table. That held on too long hug. At 7 in the morning I drove back. I want to say I went back out of pure concern for my mother, and that's mostly true. But I'd also be lying if I said I wasn't furious. Not the hot, immediate kind of fury, the cold, quiet kind, the kind that says, this is not going to be the end of this story. I knocked. Derek answered and looked at me like I was a stranger. She has an appointment at 9, I said. He tried to tell me she'd cancelled it. She hadn't. I had her phone number, and I'd already confirmed. He tried to tell me she didn't need me to drive her. I said that was her choice to make, not his. My mother came to the door. She looked between me and Derek, and for a moment I thought she was going to back down. I have watched her back down from things my whole life. I know exactly what that looks like. The slight drop of the shoulders, the smile that doesn't reach her eyes, the gentle redirect. I braced for it. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. Let's go, she said. The doctor's name was Dr. Ewan, a cardiologist who happened to have a cancellation that morning after I explained my mother's symptoms. She ran an ECG and a blood panel and pulled me aside while my mother was getting dressed. My mother had a partially blocked artery. Not critical, not yet, but the kind of thing that, untreated, becomes critical. The kind of thing that, with a few more weeks of Derek's reassurances and my mother's learned helpfulness, could have become something far worse. Dr. Ewan said she was going to refer her to a specialist at Health Sciences North and that she needed to be monitored closely over the next several months. She looked at me and said, "It's a good thing she came in." I nodded. I didn't say anything. I was very busy not crying in a cardiologist's office on a Sunday morning. In the car, my mother held her appointment paperwork in both hands and stared at it. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "He told me it was anxiety." I know. I believed him. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. What happened next happened over weeks, not days. I want to be honest about that because I've seen stories where everything resolves in a single dramatic confrontation, and real life doesn't work like that. Real life is a series of phone calls and decisions and small shifts in understanding that add up, slowly, to something irreversible. My mother began attending her cardiology appointments. I drove up twice a month, which meant I was in the house more, which meant Derek's resentment had more surface area to work with. He started making comments about how much I was interfering. He told my mother that I had always been controlling, that my concern was really about making myself feel important. Kyle backed him up, which is what Kyle did. But something had changed in my mother. It's hard to describe. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't suddenly start arguing with Derek or standing up for herself in the ways I'd always wished she would. It was subtler than that. She started asking questions. She started wanting to know things about her medication, about her prognosis, about the difference between what the doctor said and what she'd been told at home. She started to want information more than she wanted peace. That shift, quiet as it was, scared Derek more than anything I could have done. The confrontation, when it finally came, was about money. My mother had a savings account that she'd maintained since before she'd met Derek. It wasn't a large amount, maybe $42,000, some inheritance from her own mother, some careful saving over the years. I found out during one of our phone calls that Derek had been pushing her to move it into a joint account and had been doing so for several months. She'd been resisting. He was escalating. I asked her if she'd spoken to anyone about it. She hadn't. I called a legal clinic in Sudbury that offered free consultations, and I made an appointment in both our names. I told my mother what I'd done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." At the legal clinic, a lawyer named Ms. Okonkwo spent an hour with us. She explained that my mother had every right to maintain a separate account, that there was no legal obligation to consolidate finances in a marriage, and that if she ever felt pressured, financially or otherwise, there were options. She gave my mother a folder of information. My mother held it the same way she'd held the cardiology paperwork. Derek found out. I don't know how. Either my mother told him or he saw something, but he found out, and it was the first time I'd ever seen him rattled. He called me. "I want to remember this clearly because I want to get it right," he called me, not the other way around. He told me I was poisoning my mother against him. He told me I was a selfish, unstable woman who had always resented his family. He told me that if I kept sticking my nose in, there would be consequences. I said, "If you're threatening me, I'd encourage you to think carefully about what that means legally." He hung up. Kyle showed up at my mother's door 2 days later. Not mine, hers. I found out from my mother's neighbour, a retired postal worker named Mr. Arsenault, who had lived next door for 15 years and had been watching that house a lot longer than I had. He called my mother after Kyle left. He asked if she was all right. She told him yes, but her voice wasn't steady. I drove up that same evening. I am not a confrontational person. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I spent most of my life avoiding confrontation in that family, and the instinct to smooth things over is still there, even now. But there is a line, and what crossed it for me was not Kyle's arm against my throat, and it was not Derek's threats on the phone. What crossed it was my mother's voice when she told me she was fine, because I had heard that voice my whole life, and I knew exactly what it cost her to use it. I contacted a family law attorney. In Ontario, there are specific provisions around financial abuse in intimate partner relationships, and a marriage doesn't dissolve a person's right to their own assets. The attorney, a woman named Miss Chandra, based in Sudbury, was thorough and direct. She told my mother what her rights were. She helped her understand what documentation to start keeping. She was, from the first meeting, someone my mother trusted completely. I also filed a report with the Sudbury Police Service about the physical altercation with Kyle. I documented it in writing, date, time, what he said, what he did. I attached a statement from myself and noted that my mother had been in the house. The officer I spoke to was matter-of-fact and kind. He told me that having it on record was the right move regardless of what came next. Kyle was served with a notice of the report 2 weeks later. He called me from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. His message was long and increasingly incoherent. Something about how I thought I was better than everyone, how I'd always been nightless, how this was a family matter that I had no right to drag outside the family. I forwarded the voicemail to Miss Chandra. What happened to my mother happened slowly and then all at once, the way important things often do. She told Derek she wanted to separate. She told me over the phone on a Tuesday evening, very calm, like she was reading something off a list she'd been going over for a while. She said she'd made the decision herself, that she'd been thinking about it for months, that what had happened with Kyle had clarified something for her. She said she didn't want to spend the rest of her life managing his moods while her heart was half blocked, and she was too tired to call her own doctor. I sat on my apartment floor in Ottawa and didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "Okay, I'll drive up this weekend." "You don't have to." "I know," I said. "I want to." The separation was not clean or painless. Derek contested everything he could contest, and Kyle made himself difficult at every stage, showing up at the house, leaving voicemails from my mother, parking his truck outside for hours in a way that wasn't technically threatening, but was designed to feel like it. Ms. Chandra navigated all of it with a steadiness I found remarkable. My mother's assets were protected. The house, which was in both names, was settled through mediation. Derek got his half. My mother got hers. She moved to a smaller place on the east side of Sudbury, close to the waterfront. She likes to walk in the mornings. Her cardiologist says her numbers are improving. Mr. Arsenault brought her a casserole on the day she moved in. She called me to tell me about it, laughing. Actual laughing, the way I remembered her laughing when I was small, before everything got so careful. I'm not going to tell you it was easy. I'm not going to tell you the damage done over 20 years just disappeared because the circumstances changed. My mother still defaults sometimes to minimizing. She still says she's fine when she isn't. She's working on that. We both are. What I can tell you is this. The week after my mother moved into her new place, she called me on a Thursday night just to talk. No particular reason. She asked about my work, about my apartment, about whether I was eating properly. The ordinary, specific questions of a mother paying attention. I sat by my kitchen window and watched the Ottawa River catch the last of the evening light. And I thought about the night I drove to a motel parking lot and sat there for 40 minutes wondering what kind of daughter I was. A stubborn one, it turns out. The kind that drives 4 hours and doesn't leave. I think about Mr. Arsenault a lot, actually. A retired postal worker who had no obligation to anyone in that situation. Not to my mother, not to me, not to the quiet ugliness that had been going on behind that front door for years. He just noticed. He paid attention. He picked up the phone. There's something in that I keep coming back to. When I drove back to my mother's house that Sunday morning, I wasn't operating on courage. I want to be clear about that because I think people misunderstand what it looks like to do the right thing. It doesn't always feel like courage. It felt like stubbornness, mostly. Like something in me had decided that the alternative, driving back to Ottawa and waiting, was something I couldn't live with. That's not heroism. That's just knowing yourself well enough to understand what you can and can't leave undone. But here's what I've come to understand about those weeks. Every person who acted with any kind of integrity had done the work ahead of time to become someone capable of it. My mother's cardiologist ran the ECG because she'd spent years learning to pay attention to the numbers that other people dismissed. Miss Chandra knew exactly which provisions applied to my mother's situation because she'd built that knowledge deliberately, over time. Even Mr. Arsenault, he'd spent 15 years being a decent neighbour. When the moment came that it mattered, he already knew how to show up. That's the part nobody tells you about when things finally go right. It looks like a single moment. It isn't. It's the accumulated result of a lot of quiet decisions made by people who chose to keep their integrity intact, even when nobody was watching. Derek spent years telling my mother she was overreacting. Kyle spent years learning that aggression was an acceptable substitute for argument. And when the real test came, a blocked artery, a legal clinic, a report filed with the police, neither of them had any of the tools that actually matter. My mother did, though. Underneath everything that had been worn down and overridden in her, she still had the capacity to pick up her coat and walk out the door. That didn't come from nowhere. It came from some part of her that had held on, quietly, to the understanding that she deserved to make her own decisions. I think about that when I'm tempted to believe that years of pressure erase a person entirely. They don't. They just bury things. What I learned, what I'm still learning, is that clarity and action have to work together. Seeing something clearly isn't enough. I had seen what was happening in that house for years. What changed was that I started doing something specific about it, making appointments, asking questions, finding people who knew more than I did, and getting my mother in front of them. Intelligence without follow-through is just anxiety. It's what you do with what you understand that changes anything. And then you have to keep going. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when the person you love keeps saying she's fine, that's the part that costs something. Not a single dramatic confrontation, just showing up month after month for as long as it takes, because the alternative is something you can't live with. My mother walked along the waterfront this morning. She called me to tell me the ice had finally broken up on the lake. I think that's what it looks like when things go right.